I spent 40 years building a wall of silence around my life. They call me Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Barbieri, and in the underworld, my word was law and my secrets were buried in concrete. But while I was winning wars on the streets, I was losing a 42-year battle in the one place I couldn't use a gun. My own home. For 4 decades, the world thought I was the ultimate family man. The truth? My marriage was a crime scene of legal maneuvers, intimidation, and a secret settlement that cost me more than any federal heist. I kept the divorce hidden to protect my image of total control, but in the mafia, the moment you look vulnerable is the moment you become a target. Stay with me because today the silence is finally breaking. You're going to see how a single unsealed document dismantled a multi-million-dollar empire and brought a godfather to his knees. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because we're diving into the 42-year secret that Sammy the Bull would have killed to keep buried. This isn't just a divorce, it's the ultimate betrayal. The 1980s were a blur of chrome, blood, and cold-blooded expansion. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Barbieri didn't just walk through the city. He owned the very air people breathed. His rise to power was a masterclass in calculated ruthlessness, a swift and violent ascent that turned the family business into a sprawling, untouchable empire. To the associates who sat at his table and the rivals who trembled in his shadow, Sammy was the ultimate patriarch, a man of iron will and traditional values who valued family above all else. He cultivated an image of absolute stability, believing that in the underworld, the perception of a strong home was the bedrock of a strong organization. But behind the heavy oak doors of his estate, the bedrock was turning to sand. While Sammy was winning wars on the neon-lit streets, his marriage to Maria was quietly, violently disintegrating. The woman who had stood by him since the beginning had become a ghost in his own house, silenced by the same shadow he cast over the city. In the early 1980s, the inevitable finally happened. Maria filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. It was a legal strike that hit harder than any federal indictment. To Sammy, this wasn't an emotional loss, it was a security breach. He didn't see a woman in pain, he saw a leak in his armor. The decision to fight the divorce was instantaneous, but it was never born out of love or a desire to reconcile. Love was a luxury Sammy had traded for power long ago. No, he fought because his empire was built on a foundation of secrecy. A public divorce meant public records, financial disclosures, and a vulnerability that his enemies would sniff out like sharks in bloodied water. To allow Maria to leave was to admit he had lost control of his own domain, an admission that in his world was a death sentence. Sammy became the architect of a profound silence. He mobilized his legal teams and his street enforcers with the same cold precision he used to take over the docks. He used every trick in the book to delay, complicate, and bury the proceedings, ensuring the battle remained a dirty, behind-the-scenes affair. He wasn't just fighting for a marriage, he was fighting to suppress a truth that could dismantle 40 years of work. As he sat in his dim office, lit only by the amber glow of expensive scotch, Sammy knew the war for his legacy had moved from the streets to the courtroom, and he was prepared to spend decades ensuring the world never heard a single word. As the months turned into years, the courtroom became a second front in Sammy's war for dominance, a cold theater where the weapons weren't lead and powder, but motions, stays, and the suffocating weight of influence. The legal battle was no longer about a failed union. It was a high-stakes chess match where every piece on the board was disposable. Sammy's lawyers, a phalanx of high-priced sharks in silk suits, turned the simple act of discovery into an endless labyrinth. They buried Maria's team in mountains of irrelevant paperwork and filed endless appeals that stretched the horizon of a resolution until it vanished. But the true pressure was applied far from the judge's chambers. The same mafia connections that kept the city's docks quiet began to cast a long, cooling shadow over Maria's life. Mysterious cars sat idling at the end of her driveway. Her phone lines crackled with the heavy breathing of men who didn't need to speak to be understood. It was a campaign of psychological attrition designed to remind her that while she might have a lawyer, Sammy had an army. The message was implicit and terrifying. In this city there was no law higher than the bull's will. Caught in the crossfire were the children, the supposed heirs to the Barbieri legacy, who found themselves transformed into the most valuable pawns in their father's game. Their childhood was a series of staged photographs and forced smiles, a curated performance of a happy family, that Sammy used as a shield against the rumors of his crumbling house. They lived in a gilded prison where every holiday was a tactical maneuver and every conversation was monitored for signs of betrayal. They watched as their mother withered under the constant threat of violence and their father grew more distant, his eyes perpetually fixed on the next move. The emotional toll was a silent poison. seeping into the foundation of the very family Sammy claimed to be protecting. He wasn't just complicating a legal proceeding. He was dismantling the souls of the people he supposedly loved to preserve an image of absolute control. For Sammy, the children weren't just his blood, they were leverage. He moved them across the board with a chilling lack of sentiment, using visitation rights and financial support as bargaining chips to force Maria into a corner. As the litigation entered its second decade, the house on the hill stood as a monument to a father who had traded his children's peace for a wall of silence that was slowly beginning to feel like a tomb. The 1980s bled into the 90s, and eventually the digital dawn of the new millennium transformed the city, but within the inner sanctum of the Barbieri organization, time seemed to stand still. Sammy's empire had mutated into a multi-billion-dollar behemoth, its tentacles reaching into legitimate construction, offshore banking, and logistics. To the outside world, he was the elder statesman of the underworld, a man whose domestic life was as legendary and rock-solid as his business interests. But the 42-year secret was no longer just a legal file. It had become a ticking time bomb, the pressure building behind a dam that Sammy had spent a lifetime reinforcing with threats and payoffs. The crack didn't come from a wiretap or a federal raid on a warehouse. It came from a man named Nicky the Gent Rossi, a former top-tier associate who had sat at Sammy's right hand for 20 years. Nicky had been the one to deliver the envelopes to the lawyers. He had been the one to orchestrate the accidental encounters that kept Maria in a state of perpetual fear. But in the modern era of high-stakes federal cooperation, Nicky found himself facing a life sentence for racketeering. The FBI expected him to give up the locations of the bodies or the codes to the Swiss accounts. Instead, Nicky reached for a different kind of dagger. He realized that the one thing that could truly dismantle Sammy wasn't a murder charge, it was the truth about his hypocrisy. Nicky began to sing, and for the first time the song wasn't about blood. He provided the shocking details of the hidden divorce, documenting the decades of intimidation, the diverted union funds used to pay off Maria's legal counsel, and the systematic abuse of the very family values Sammy preached to his captains. The web of deceit, woven so tightly for over 4 decades, began to unravel with a speed that left the organization paralyzed. In the mafia world, where respect is the only currency that matters, the revelation that their leader had been extorted by his own wife's legal team for half a century was a lethal blow to his authority. As the informant statements hit the desks of federal prosecutors, the shockwaves decimated the hierarchy. Soldiers who had gone to prison to protect Sammy's honor suddenly felt like fools. Captains who had looked to him as a moral compass in a lawless world saw only a man who had lied to his own blood. The silence Sammy had spent a lifetime constructing was finally breaking, and as the whispers turned into a roar, the bull realized that the dagger in his back didn't come from a rival gang, it came from the 42 years of secrets he had tried to bury alive. The end came not with a bang, but with the dry, rhythmic sound of a court clerk's seal breaking. For 42 years, the file labeled Barbieri versus Barbieri had been the most dangerous ghost in the state's judicial archive, but under the relentless pressure of the federal investigation, a judge finally signed the order to unseal it. Within hours, the digital age turned a private tragedy into a public execution. The unsealed truth hit the news cycle like a physical blow, revealing a detail so scandalous it made Sammy's racketeering charges look like petty theft. A secret, multi-million-dollar settlement paid in installments to Maria for nearly half a century, funded by the very coffers the organization's soldiers had bled to fill. The media frenzy was instantaneous and voracious. Satellites and camera crews swarmed the Barbieri estate, their lenses hungry for a glimpse of the Iron King, who was now being mocked as the man who paid for silence he couldn't keep. The headlines didn't focus on his body count or his control over the docks. They focused on the hypocrisy. The public reveal of the massive payoff shattered Sammy's aura of invincibility overnight. In the underworld, power is a fragile illusion maintained by the belief that the leader is untouchable, but the settlement proved that Sammy had been bleeding internally for years, held hostage by a 42-year-old legal debt he was too proud to admit. Inside the organization, the air turned cold and stagnant. At the social clubs and the backroom bars where Sammy's captains gathered, the conversation was no longer about the next shipment or the latest hit. It was about the betrayal of the family. The soldiers who had lived by the code of Omerta looked at the unsealed documents and saw a leader who had violated the very rules he used to execute others. If the boss could pay off his wife to hide his failures, what else was he hiding? The Iron King watched from behind his reinforced windows as his influence evaporated. His associates didn't look at him with fear anymore. They looked at him with a lethal, calculating curiosity. The impact was immediate. Orders that were once followed without question were now met with silence or clarifying questions. The hierarchy, once a rigid pyramid of loyalty, began to fracture into self-interested cells. Sammy sat in his mahogany-paneled office, listening to the sirens in the distance and the incessant ringing of phones he no longer wanted to answer. He realized that the document wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the formal dissolution of his legacy. The man who had spent a lifetime building a wall of silence was finally drowning in the noise of his own exposure, realizing that when the truth is unsealed, there is no lock in the world strong enough to hold back the flood. The silence that Sammy had spent 42 years buying finally became his only companion, but it was no longer the silence of power, it was the silence of a tomb. The empire didn't fall to a rival's fire or a federal sweep. It simply withered as the respect that fed it turned to ash. The Iron King was now just an old man in a cold house, watching through security monitors as his remaining associates cleared out their lockers and vanished into the night. The myth of the Barbieri family values had been the glue holding the syndicate together, and with that glue dissolved by the unsealed truth, the entire structure slid into the abyss. Sammy's final days were a grim inventory of loss. The federal government, emboldened by the evidence of diverted funds found in the divorce settlement, moved in with a series of asset forfeitures that stripped him of the very mahogany desk he had used to rule. His children, the pawns he had moved so ruthlessly across the legal board, ceased all contact, choosing to build lives far away from the shadow of his deception. Maria, finally free from the campaign of intimidation, moved into a quiet life that Sammy would never be a part of. He was a man exposed by his own lies, realizing too late that the most expensive thing he ever bought was a secret that didn't stay kept. The moral of the Barbieri legacy was written in the dust of his empty social clubs. The truth is a patient hunter. It doesn't care about iron fists or billions in offshore accounts. It simply waits for the foundation to rot. Sammy had believed he could curate reality, that he could be a god of his own narrative, but he ended as a cautionary tale for the next generation of sharks. He sat on a plastic chair in a sparsely furnished apartment, a far cry from the 80th floor penthouses of his prime, listening to the radiator hiss. He was the richest man in the cemetery of his own reputation, proving that power without integrity is just a slow-acting poison. As the sun set on the ruins of his criminal and personal life, the world moved on, indifferent to the man who had tried to stop time with a checkbook. The bull was gone, replaced by the crushing realization that the truth always comes out eventually, and when it does, it doesn't just reveal who you are, it destroys the person you pretended to be. The empire was gone, the family was gone, and Salvatore Barbieri was finally, truly alone. The downfall of Salvatore Sammy the Bull Barbieri is more than just a crime story. It's a masterclass in the inevitable collapse of a life built on a foundation of lies. It serves as a stark reminder that in the world of high stakes and deep secrets, the truth isn't just a discovery, it's a reckoning. But what do you think? Was his downfall fate, betrayal, or the price he was always destined to pay? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful crime stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next video.